afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me. My name is Caroline Drewett. I am the founder and the director of Coast to Coast Education. I'm also a contributor for Master Investor magazine. I write for the millennials population, which is in general 18 to 35-year-olds. And my speciality is writing about starting up businesses and being an entrepreneur, but generally with no external funding. So it's completely different from most things here, given that this is an investment show. So yeah, if you have any questions, then at the end we'll have a quick Q&A. So I'm going to talk to you about my company, Coast to Coast Education. It currently works from London, Hong Kong, and the Galapagos Islands. So fairly different areas of the world and completely different markets. So one of the hardest things has been to adjust from one market to another. As you can imagine, the Galapagos Islands are small islands off the coast of Ecuador in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And I have an office over there with about 6 or 7 full-time staff. They lose internet for days at a time, given the lack of infrastructure. And I spend most of my time in Hong Kong, where I'm at the other end of the spectrum. So in Hong Kong, we have, obviously, it's a 24-hour city. Most people work 6 days a week. And the two could not be more different. I started everything from London, which I kind of think is somewhere in the middle. London works solid 5 days a week. Some people work 6 days a week. And everything tends to generally run. So this talk's going to be roughly about how I started, how I expanded, and some of the major problems that I've had along the way and how I overcame them. So starting up is what I believe to be the easy part. Most people think about starting a business. Where do you begin? And for some, it's a lot easier than for others. I was lucky that I started when I was 21. I was naive. I had no idea what the risks were going to be, and I was in debt from university. It's always good to start with nothing, because I suppose the risk is, in theory, lower. And although it's daunting, as with anything new, it's also really interesting for the first year. Everything's new, everything's interesting, and so you spend every waking hour on a business. According to Bloomberg, an astronomical 80% of businesses fail in the first 18 months, which makes you wonder why on earth anybody ever starts. It makes you think, why would you bother when you could just sit in your 9 to 5 and have no risk on your shoulders? You spend 7 days a week working 20 hours a day for something which has an incredibly high chance of failing. But of course it gives you a lot of other things. It gives you freedom, it gives you choice, it gives you not only job satisfaction, but life satisfaction. It's one of the only ways that you can actually make a difference. The financial uncertainty and the fear of failure behind running a company are, of course, what prevent most people from starting something from scratch. And it's what prevents people from building their own dreams, which is why we end up working 40 hours a week, building somebody else's dreams for them. So, starting with the company. I started off as an education company, and as it's St. George's Day, I thought I should mention that working in Britain is very different to working anywhere else in the world. We are a pessimistic society. Most people tell you that whatever great idea you have, it will fail. I work in education, and the first thing that most people said to me is, you will get sued. Someone will sue you at some point. Health and safety is everywhere, and the sheer amount of red tape and bureaucracy, partly since joining the EU and partly that's just evolved, is absolutely huge in Britain. We have policies for everything and documents for everything, and half the time they're duplicated. And as a young 21-year-old, I remember just pouring through documents and documents and documents before I'd even started. So you're slightly discouraged, and you compare that to the American dream of go out, do your own thing. Americans celebrate every small success as if they've just rediscovered the atom, and it's great, it's wonderful. And they don't see failure as a negative. They see failure as you've tried, you've been gutsy. Whereas over here, we see failure as, why have you wasted your time on that rubbish, on that nonsense? So when I first mentioned I was starting a business to people, they gave me 1,000,001 reasons of why it wouldn't work. And only now, since I've succeeded, do people say, oh, that was a good idea. I'd like to do something like that. So I myself started this. This is a snapshot of what I do in the summer. This is where we started. I started one summer with a £10,000 loan, having just come out of university. I grew up in what the government would describe now as a low-income family. And having been working for 9 years already when I started the company, I knew what rubbish jobs were. I'd worked as a waitress for my first job at the age of 12. And if there's anything that inspires you to starting a business, it is clearing up a bar at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night at the end of a 15-hour shift. So I hadn't had the luxury of these prestigious internships that you get these days. Most internships you either pay to go on or they're completely free and unfunded. So the luxury of that was not an option for me, but I decided to take the plunge, take a loan out, and of my first £10,000 loan, I spent £4,000 of it on accreditation, on bureaucracy, on having an inspector turn up and check that this was what it said it was, and I wasn't just giving visas to people from around the world to try and get into the UK. I started the company while I was working. I originally grew up in Croydon, so I was working for Croydon Council, which is probably one of the most soul-destroying jobs that you could ever have. And it made me it kick-started me into starting this. Of course, with education, there are always some hurdles. And now it happens to make money. But the reason that I started it was never money. And that is often the case these days. People say, why did you start something? Well, it happens to make money, but that isn't necessarily the starting point. So these days, why on earth would you send your child to me to come on a summer school? I had a number of hurdles when I first started. And starting something brand new with no brand name, with no track record, with no one to justify or validate why on earth these parents from abroad should send their children to a 3-week summer school in Ascot. It's not like you're buying a scarf from the internet. If it's a dodgy site, you might lose 15 quid. You send your child on a 3-week summer camp, that's obviously a lot more important. But the internet's really helped. So I looked up internet and social media effects and how useful they are. Since the beginning of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, I found that the company has just absolutely rocketed. You get validation. People like it. Your friends like it. They start thinking, actually, yeah, I'll consider that. And we've actually had a number of students that come to the UK to our education course solely found through Facebook. They look at our website, they look at our Facebook, they say, right, that must be a genuine company, off you go. And they send their children there, send them on a plane, and we pick them up the other end. And so it must be useful, but Forbes claim that only 15% of companies actually manage to track the use of social media to a sale. Now that is nothing for a company, 15%. So it's really important to realize how important it is for you, how important it is for your company, and whether it's even right for you. Obviously, for retail, for sales, for things like that, it's a lot more important than for something like the service that we're providing. The benefits of the internet, that you're in theory reaching the whole world. I've reached Russia and Italy and Spain in my first year. However, the negative is, so is every other company out there. They're managing to get people, just like that, at the click of their fingers, people that I would never, ever have been able to reach on a £10,000 loan. So my infrastructure of the company, the transport that I had, was virtually non-existent. In my first year, I could not afford to fly to Russia, fly to Ukraine, and fly to Italy to recruit students. But at the click of a button, I had Facebook there, and I was able to just draw the students in. The idea that social media is genuine is a big debatable question. How useful is it for you? And I know a lot of people pay per click for things. So people pay for likes, they pay for tweets, they pay for things like that. And trying to get the most genuine experience has been really important in making your company seem like it's actually there working in the first year when you're trying to start things up. This is a table that has been produced by Forbes that looks at the social media effects. So the column on the left is 2010 and the column on the right is 2014. And you can see how much it's increased within 4 years. People now trust social media way more than they just trust random websites. There's so many dodgy random websites, but if someone's got 3,000 likes on their Facebook page, you're a lot more likely to think about them. And included in that are companies which now profit from that. So we have used and work with companies which have been created just to, their sole use is to get people to click on abandoned shopping carts. So in theory, that is a huge market now. Why have you clicked on Facebook but not bought something from them? You can now get all of those stats there at your fingertips, and that kind of thing can be really, really useful. So going through my hurdles that I've had, hurdle 1 is the social stigma that you get from starting a company. For some reason, people don't seem to really complain when you work for a company that doesn't seem that ethical. But when you start one, everyone questions you and everyone questions what you do. You work for the mining industry or oil and gas or diamonds. You expect people to say, are you sure you really want to work in that? But I started working in education and found that other people said, this is immoral, you're working in private education. Again, we Brits have a bit of a social stigma about private education. Only 7% of Britons are privately educated, and yet it seems like those other 93% have a huge amount to say about what they think about it. Having always valued private education myself, I received a bursary and a scholarship to a private school. I think it's really important to realise why you're working in something. So I started at private education to give something back. I received a bursary, and we now provide scholarships to poor students from low-income families around the world. Even Mark Zuckerberg was recently at the hands of angry locals when he's now offered free internet to local communities in India. So rural communities now have the option of free internet if they market their products through Facebook. And you might have read about it. It's a really interesting concept. And it was publicized in so many different magazines and newspapers. And the next thing you know, you turn on the news, and all the local communities in India are protesting against him, saying that he is immoral, he is stopping them from the free market, he's giving competition to certain people who use the internet, and he's being unfair. And it made me realize that whatever you're in, however positive and optimistic and helpful you're trying to be, there will always be critics out there. You give free internet to people and you offer them something on a plate and they still protest against you. And that was the same with education. I felt like I was giving somebody something free, giving these opportunities to people, and we're giving low-income families the opportunity to come to Britain every summer and learn English. And there are always people telling you, well, some people have to pay and that's immoral. And I think that toughening up and that hardening is something that's really important to just get over early on. So my second hurdle was, of course, finance. And financing for different people is, of course, different. So the benefits of starting a company when you're 21, you have debt already. What's a bit more? It doesn't really make a big difference. You've got no mortgage. You've probably got no children. Whereas, of course, that means you've got fewer contacts and you have hardly any experience. So you just have to go in all guns blazing and hope for the best. Coming out of a well-paid city job when you've got a wife that doesn't work with 2 children in private school makes starting a company a lot harder. And it's important to realize that when reading all these magazines and I was trying to work out what I needed to do for my financing, actually, it's just different for everybody, and you need to work out what's right for you. One of the most surprising things that I found is the lack of change that most people have been willing to make when it comes to starting a business. You work in a job Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and you think that when you work in a business, that's going to be exactly the same. But actually, it becomes all-encompassing. And I think unless you're willing to take on that role, it's not going to be worth it for you. So how to grow? Having started in London, I then moved everything over to the Galapagos. We started to give scholarships to students from the Galapagos, and every year I fund a $16,000 US scholarship scheme for students to come from the Galapagos Islands to the UK to study English. From that, we then managed to get good relationships and partnerships with local institutions, and I now have exclusive partnerships with the Charles Darwin Foundation and Ecuador's Ministry of Education. However, from that, naturally, everything grew. Lots of British schools said, we'd like to go to the Galapagos Islands, and I then had tourists going, I had parents going, I had a number of other people going. And the big plunge of, actually, I need people on the ground there. How am I going to do it? Well, the cost was astronomical. Flying people from the UK, paying them a UK salary to go and live in what is essentially a lesser economically developed country is really difficult financially. I had to completely change my staffing structure. So while originally I had intended to pay staff a UK salary, everything had to move to commission. So they get students out there, they get parents out there, they get luxury tourists out there, they get the commission. And I think that flexibility was something that I just hadn't anticipated, and that was really important to the change and the growth over there. I considered getting external funding for my growth. There's investors everywhere here, and of course things like crowdfunding are huge, which I'll touch on in a minute. But the thing that I love about the company is when you work in education or in a service, everything should be high quality. And as soon as you lose that high quality, as soon as you bring in investors from elsewhere, that quality is lost. Trusting others and trying to find a local partner is virtually impossible when you're used to a westernized view of what good service is. And of course, the overhead and expenses. Sending your British staff over to the Galapagos and Ecuador is virtually impossible for a small company like mine was. So, how do you make the decision of whether you retain 100% of your company and don't go towards any external funding, or you sell out and you have people invest in you and you give something away? This is the image that most people have of the Galapagos Islands. And this is actually the reality. So the image of beautiful wildlife, everything's perfect, is what most people imagine when they go there, and which is exactly what my staff imagined when they turned up on day one. They arrive, and this is the biggest research station over there. And as you can see, it's a group of about 10 buildings, none of which have air conditioning, none of which have running water. It's very, very basic, and that's really what the place looks like. So I then thought, right, staff are struggling a little bit, maybe I should crowdfund. And the benefits of crowdfunding are fairly widespread. The expertise that you get from external sources can really help you. Crowdfunding is everywhere. I mean, I know that today there's been a number of crowdfunding talks and stands, and it's really important for a lot of people. You also gain a lot of publicity from it. I mean, these days, the Cereal Cafe, the Cat Cafe in London, Shoreditch has all sorts of cafes and all sorts of quirky businesses that have been crowdfunded. They get publicity because they're interesting, and they're not like anything else that anybody's ever seen. And that can be really beneficial. Of course, you have a cash injection, which is good for you, and reduced risk. You are losing part of your company, so all of a sudden, somebody else has the weight on their shoulders, and it is not just you, which, for me, is appealing. The pre-sales and the tests to the market, you can actually see whether people are going to like it before you stick loads of people in another country. So all of these things are really important. You can look at crowdfunding and think, this is potentially great, but how useful is it to you? If you're a complete control freak, there's no point going anywhere near it. So I chose to keep the company 100% mine. I didn't want any debt to banks. I knew that if I expanded or if I crowdfunded, I was going to have to lose some of my capital, And in theory, if I then wanted to buy that back, I was always going to be in debt. I wanted full control. Obviously, the benefit is that you get 100% profit. And the most important thing is that you retain the true quality and the true service that the company has, and it's been successful as it is. Why would you suddenly lose out? And you suddenly have to answer to other investors and other people. So, knowing the markets. The markets in Britain are completely different to the markets in South America. When I look at the commitment that I put in to working 7 days a week, partly in Hong Kong, partly in London, partly in Ecuador, you then move over there, and I had these British staff working in Ecuador, and they just tear their hair out. You suddenly turn up to a business meeting, and everything's locked, the doors are all shut, and there's nobody there. I remember having a group of luxury tourists turn up to the Galapagos and want to go fishing for the day. And we'd employed a really good local fisherman. And tourists are waiting at their hotel. And we've used this guy loads of times before, takes everybody marlin fishing, $500 US a day, off he goes. Doesn't turn up for the first hour. Waits, we say, don't worry, wait, he'll be here. Another half an hour goes by, and we have to say, we're really sorry, the fisherman isn't turning up, not sure where he is. They go off, fairly annoyed, we give them another day, and it's all okay, and we've salvaged the crisis. And a few days later, my staff's sitting in their office, and in he strolls and says, right, I'm ready to go fishing now, where are your tourists? And you think, who on earth turns up 3 days late to work? But that is the mentality of these, of the island over there, and everything's so relaxed and so great that it makes you realize there is no point trying to get in the mind of someone who turns up 3 days late to work and be on your English schedule of being punctual everywhere. So that's one of the hardest things, because knowing the market costs a lot of money. The only way to know the market is to physically go there, live there for a bit, and I spend usually 2 or 3 trips a year. I go to the Galapagos and I go onto the islands, I meet local people, and I make local partnerships, and it makes life a lot easier once I've learned how to deal with the situations that they're likely to come across. Of course, that's expensive, and that's one of the reasons that most people crowdfund. So, having now moved to Hong Kong, which is the complete opposite to the Galapagos, in Hong Kong everybody works 7 days a week, 20 hours a day. It's really important to, again, go through what they're going through. So one of the most important things is trying to be on each person's environment and in each person's culture, wherever you are and whoever you're dealing with. So my final 2 points are the most important things for me. The first one has been flexible, changing your staffing, changing your locations, trying to work out the local markets, and trying to work out what happens when things go wrong. I mean, in every company, things do go wrong, and the benefits of growing slowly and not growing in one quick burst of investment, one quick burst of crowdfunding, is that when your mistakes do happen, they happen small. Someone not turning up for the day, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. You have that on a huge scale, and it's one of the worst things that can happen. Fitting to the local markets is key, and as salaries fluctuate, there's a lot of sacrifice over there, not only for you, but for your staff. And my second point is quality. One of the most important things is sticking true to your quality. Even now, as Facebook has been named one of the 10 most valued companies in the world, Mark Zuckerberg still says the importance of it is connecting people, not the fact that he's worth $45 billion. And I think that is really important, and it is easy to lose sight of the fact of, oh, this area is going to make me loads of money, this area is going to make us loads of money, and actually stick true to, well, why do people even want to come near you? Why don't they just pick the investor next door? For me, sacrifice has been essential, but that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it. I'm working 7 days a week for something I love, rather than for 5 days a week for, well, something I don't enjoy and find difficult. It's not necessarily a negative. It's achievable, and for me, the most important thing is supporting millennials and women in the world of business to try and succeed and make a difference in the world. So thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi there.
Hi. You mentioned you started at an early age. How did you whittle down the options, what you wanted to do in the future, and how did you manage to stick to it? Did you have any other plans?
Yeah, so it has actually changed a lot. So I started in just education, and now we do tourism around the world as well. So I started just as education in the UK. And I went into that originally because that's all I had experience in. So I worked on summer camps and I worked in education. And the reason that I went into what I went into was because I worked in a private education company where children were numbers. And I remember a student having an evaluation form at the end, and it said, "What do you think you contributed to the course?" And he wrote, "My father's money." And I thought, wow, I need to start something up where people actually feel valued. And so we started the company. And then since then, it's just grown. So it wasn't intentional to go to the Galapagos. That's just where I happened to get a good scholarship scheme going. And then things have just expanded there. And then obviously, Asian education is huge. So we decided to move east. So it's slowly expanded just into where the company's been successful and to where people have enjoyed it.
Thank you.
What do you find most challenging about being an entrepreneur?
By far the most challenging thing is having other people you give 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and people having no concept or understanding or appreciation of how hard the first few years are. I think now everybody sees the glamorous lifestyle of traveling every month to different places to, have meetings with people. And actually, the first few months, I was living on £10 a week for my food and living in essentially a student's lifestyle for the first 3 years. And it's not until suddenly everything clicks, everything comes together. I spent about 2 years in the Galapagos working for free. Everything was free that we did over there. And no one sees that. And now you suddenly see the rewards of, wow, it's going really well. But that first initial thing, everybody thinks, oh, she just started a company and it's sort of appeared out of nowhere. And so that idea that nobody else appreciates the risk on your shoulders as you're starting something up, they see the benefits, but the work to get in there was ridiculously hard.
Hello. You mentioned that you work like 7 days a week, and I was just wondering, that might be fun now, but long term for your business, what's your plan? Do you plan to sell it, to pass it on to family members? Because I always think to myself that as a business, probably the main asset is you, because you're running it, but then you can't ever take yourself out of that picture. So what's your plan?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's difficult when at the moment I love it. I just, as you said, and that is the asset that there's a lot of things that at the moment I'm training a couple of staff up to try and take on those roles, but eventually they might move on as well, and then what do you do? So long term, the goal is always, of course, to be bought out. But in education, that's a lot less likely. And that's why, in theory, moving east is a good idea, because a lot of people, there is less stigma about buying an education company and just having it as purely profit. And in England, if someone said to me, why do I do what I do? And I said, to make shed loads of money, then people would kick you out the pub and say, don't come back. Whereas over in Asia, people actually appreciate that education is a commodity, and they do buy education businesses over there, and they appreciate that if you invest in your child through luxury clothes, nice brands, in Britain that's acceptable. In Asia, it's acceptable to spend money on education, and I think that is the long-term aim. But it's quite difficult to explain that to people over here.
Hiya. What was your biggest challenge starting up, and how did you overcome it?
The biggest challenge starting up? My complete lack of business knowledge was fairly difficult at the beginning. I started something that I love rather than in something that I thought was going to succeed. So at the beginning, I had no idea that it was going to give me enough money to live off for the rest of the year. I studied theology with philosophy at university, so it's not like I went and did a business degree. And really, the only way that I learned how to run a business was to run a business and to make mistakes the hard way. And I worked for the first probably 18 months alongside running the business. So I didn't just quit my job and off I went. I stayed at Croydon Council for 18 months, working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And then it was only in the evenings and the weekends that I worked on the business. And then about 18 months in, I had enough money to actually go full-time. And I think all the mistakes that I made, luckily, were made on a relatively small scale. So not being quick enough on emails, not really understanding the marketing side of the company very well was really important for me. But luckily, when you're doing it as alongside another job, it's not quite as disastrous as if someone's just plonked £50,000 in front of you and you've just accidentally squandered the whole lot. Thank you ever so much, everybody.